So first things first. The girls who get it, get it. So today we're going to talk about Japanese children's books. Now y'all have heard me rant about how much I love illustrated children's books, the way they introduce you to new topics, the way they can break down heavy things like internment camps in World War II in an accessible way that does nothing to diminish the value, the importance of what is being taught, and stories of fairy tales and folk tales and magic people and men who will go through the ends of the earth in order to save their mystical wives. I cannot tell you why I've suddenly gotten into Japanese children's stories. I think it's because this past month I taught my first module on Shinto, which is an indigenous religion of Japan, and now I've just been seeing so many of those references and images in this work that I previously would not have noticed. So the first book I want to talk about is The Snow Wife, which of course is by Robert D. Sansucci, who is one of my favorite children's book authors, point blank period. Now this is a book I actually read many years ago when I was a kid, and as soon as I saw the cover I had that jolt of recognition and was so excited to pick it up again. Something I did not notice when I was a kid though was the dedication in memory of Yoshiko Uchida. And wouldn't you know it, I have a Yoshiko Uchida book right here that we'll talk about in a second. I did not buy these together knowing that, so I felt like that was a really sweet coincidence. Also, Elliot, I don't know who you are, I don't know where you are, but you should know Merry Christmas from Mama and Daddy, 1998. So, this story tells the tale of a woodcutter who falls in love with a beautiful, mysterious woman before finding out that she is actually the woman of the snow, a spirit who actually ended up killing his former woodcutting mentor many years ago when they were trapped in the cold. And in addition to the absolutely beautiful images, which I'll show you, like I love the depth in this. I love the way you can see the texture in the clothing and the way the light and shadow plays on the skin. This book, more than any other in this stack, was so clearly influenced and inspired by and had elements of Shintoism that it was so much fun to reread it as an adult, as opposed to a kid who didn't really understand the context. So first, the woman of the snow is described as a spirit, also known as a yokai. Now, some yokai can be mischievous, some can be helpful, some can be deadly, but they are not kami, which are the god/deities, even though that's not a direct translation, because in Shinto, kami can be, a force of nature, it can be a mountain, it could be a dead ancestor, but later on in this book, when we meet the wind god, it is very clear from his portrayal and from his powers that he is a kami, not a yokai. In addition, one of the things I love about this is that you can see certain not rituals, what am I thinking of? Certain shrines, like this one, to the wind god, or temple, that have a torii gate. So as I understand them, torii gates are almost kind of like a marker separating the sacred world from the profane, if you're into Eliade, or the holy world, the spiritual world, from the everyday. And you can also see torii gates often in bodies of water. You're supposed to bow before you enter them. And I love that there are all these little things that I simply did not understand as a kid. In addition, there's a scene where the woodcutter is running from this ogress with long hair looking to kill him, and he disrupts a shrine of stones that the kami, the wind god, gets pissed at him for. But he understands that in order to defeat this woman and make the path safer for the future god, for the god and future pilgrims, he has to do this. And I really like that, because when we talk in the end of the book, when he talks to the wind god and the god is like, I should punish you, again, I was thinking about Shinbatsu, which is a punishment, often an illness, that kami will put on human beings who disrespect their shrines. So this is a really sweet book about a woodcutter who is trying desperately to be reconnected with his wife after he broke a certain promise. It's a little bit scary because, her main job is to kill people trapped in the cold, and you have creatures like the mountain woman who are covered in silky white hair and to eat humans. You also have creatures like the mountain man who are short and stubby and incredibly strong. Again, beautiful illustrations, but I also really loved all of the little indicators and reminders that this is a story set in Japan. It is a Japanese folktale, and seeing all these elements of Shinto, seeing the shrines and the torii gate and the conversation that the woodcutter has with the wind kami about making a shrine or an altar that him and his children and his grandchildren will pray to and protect. All of that ties into everything I was learning about and teaching a little bit with my students the past semester. So The Snow Wife by Robert D. Souci and illustrated by Stephen T. Johnson. Next, we have The Bracelet by Yoshiko Uchida and illustrated by Joanna Yardley. This book is about a young girl, Emmy, and the bracelet that her best friend, Lori, gives her in 2nd grade when her entire family is sent to internment camps. So if you are not aware, during World War II, when America was at war with Japan after Pearl Harbor, the United States decided to view every single Japanese person, whether they were citizens or not, whether they had committed a crime or not, spoiler alert, most of them had not, treat them like enemies, treat them as infiltrators or traitors to their country, and took away all of their belongings, took away all of their homes, all their wealth, and sent them to internment camps, mainly out west. Internment camps on American soil during the same war in which another ethnicity was put in camps for no reason of their own. You know, it's the hypocrisy for me. Like, how in World War II we had American soldiers fighting in Germany to liberate people from camps, and in the United States we had our own camps. Yes, there were differences in that the Japanese internment camps, you know, they were not being gassed, they were not being taken on death marches. I'm not trying to compare like the severity of the imprisonment, mainly the fact that the United States government, if it is good at anything, is good at hypocrisy. So in this story you have this beautiful little 2nd grader. Again, love these illustrations, love the texture in her hair and her lashes, and this very, very, very familiar, at least to me, expression on children when they're pondering deep thoughts, who is sent to an internment camp with her family. Her father already being in a separate camp for the crime of working for a Japanese company. And this is one of those books that, for some reason, again, perhaps of my own bias about children's books, even though I try to unroot it in my mind that they have to be light and happy, I thought was going to have a happy ending. But how can a story like this have a happy ending when a family is taken from everything they've known simply because of the way they look, when a family is forced to live in an apartment that's just a poorly converted horse stable and are not given the proper resources, schooling, healthcare, education to have even remotely the same quality of life they had before, and frankly the quality of life they deserve just as human people. Like, this book, in addition to talking about some of those heavy themes, also really harps on the idea of memory, physical memory, sense memory, and the bracelet that she is given, she is so passionate and protective of because she believes it'll help her remember her friend. But over time, she realizes that physical things fade away, things get lost, things are destroyed. But just like she doesn't need a picture to help remember her father, or doesn't need to live in a house anymore to remember her bedroom, she doesn't need the bracelet necessarily to remember her friend and remember what it's like to be loved by someone who is completely different from her. This book also has a little note in the back and an afterword where they talk about World War II, the internment camps in 1942, and the fact that 120,000 West Coast Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were citizens, were imprisoned out west. It wasn't until apparently 1988, which I did not know, that the United States government officially apologized. So 1942 to 1988, and then made symbolic restitution, which maybe this is my blackness showing, but symbolic restitution, is that restitution? What about all the wealth that was taken from these families? What about the property, the businesses? Were they in any way compensated for that? And if they were compensated, was it at the value of those items today? Somehow I highly doubt that. But this is The Bracelet by Uchida, and again, I thought it was a very sweet serendipitous coincidence that I purchased this book that was dedicated posthumously to this author. So next we have The Peachboy. The Peachboy is illustrated by Jeffrey Smith and written by Eric Metaxas. This one I struggled with. Now, it wasn't because of the illustrations, which I enjoyed, but were not my necessarily particular style. It was mainly because, despite this being one of the longest of the books, I felt like I was missing a lot of the story. The story of the Peach Boy is a boy who was born out of a huge giant peach to an elderly couple whose children had been captured by evil ogres years and years before. He grows quickly, he grows strong in a very Paul Bunyan type way. He's very respected by the animals and other people, and he goes on this long journey to find this isle of death, find this isle of evil, defeat the ogres, and rescue all the people, accompanied by all these animals. And again, there were just certain moments where I felt like, oh, he's really well known, but for what? Like, we just jumped from him being 15 and living at home to going on the journey to the Isle and suddenly every animal's heard of him. Okay, they talk about the idea of during the long travel of him to the Isle and him and his companions, there were moments where he felt like he was in heaven because of how many birds and fish and animals were accompanying him. But then weeping when he remembers that no, he is on a journey to fight evil and that he lives in a world that is cohabitated by death. And I really like that statement. I think it rings very true. But in the context of this story, it suddenly felt like a bit dark, like a bit out of place with these stories of, monkeys and birds bickering over dumplings and pheasants wanting to peck at other animals to get his attention. Like, it just seemed a bit abrupt compared to what was around it. I also noticed that in the end, yes, he does, spoiler alert, defeat the ogres and save all of the people that have been captured. But we never see him reunited with his family. It ends just with the ship heading back home. And I don't know, considering how difficult it was for his parents to let him go because they had already lost other children. And actually, one of my favorite images from this book is him hugging his parents goodbye. I love this. I love looking at the size difference between couples and their children. Like, they are on their tippy toes holding this boy close before he leaves. The fact that we weren't reunited with them at the end, like, I don't know. Like, I did a little research, and the Peachboy is a Japanese folktale. They didn't just make this up for marketing. But I think I'd rather read a different adaptation of the story because while I feel like there are elements there that I would find interesting, and while I did enjoy the illustrations somewhat, even though again they weren't really my style, I have a feeling that this may not be the best, or this may not be my personal favorite adaptation/translation of this story. So that was The Peachboy. Next, we have one of my absolute favorite books of all time, and that is Grandfather's Journey. Now, similarly to the other books in this pile, I'm going to talk about these illustrations, but in a completely different way. So to give some context, this book was written and illustrated by Alan Say, and it is semi-autobiographical, or I guess more a biography of his grandfather that then bleeds into his own life. So his grandfather was born and raised in Japan, came to the United States, traveled the country, saw all these amazing, beautiful things, settled down here, specifically in California with, a lot of other Japanese immigrants, but then had this deep urge to go back to Japan to see the hills and the mountains and the friends of his youth. So when his child is grown, he brings them back to Japan, back to the village he was from. However, his daughter, being a woman who grew up in San Francisco in the city, wanted to live a city life. So he built a house for her in the city. She fell in love, got married, and the child that they had is this author, Alan Say. And similarly to his grandfather, he spent his entire childhood and upbringing until he was a young man in Japan before coming to the United States. And you have in this narrative a image of his grandfather and himself, Alan, as two people caught in between two worlds, in the sense that when they're in Japan, they miss California. When they're in California, they miss Japan. There are things they love about each of them, and as a person living in this liminal space, Alan feels closer to his grandfather. So that's a story that I love as someone who has moved to a variety of states, who has had the opportunity to live in another country, who knows what it feels like to have loved ones in a variety of places, and feel like you can't always bring them together. Even though I don't have an immigrant experience, I identified with that. And these are some of my favorite illustrations, just period, because each of them, I feel, is a painting. Now, not all stories lend themselves to these paintings, these still images that look like they could be photographs because they are just so beautiful and crisp and precise. But for this story, a story that emphasizes so heavily the sights that his grandfather saw in the United States and how they compare to the familiar terrain of his home with the people. It's just, I absolutely love them. Even something like this image of Alan Say's mother. I don't know if this is based on a real photograph, but the choice to have this white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed doll, which of course I'm sure was common at that time, with this tiny, beautiful little Japanese girl, just seems so striking in a book in which they're talking about cross-cultural influences, about a family lineage that bounces back and forth between Japan, between the United States, and I absolutely love it. This book does have a bit of a melancholy ending, in that at the very end of his life, Alan's grandfather wanted to make it back to California, but unfortunately couldn't, and lived out the rest of his life in the village. And then in the end, Alan himself goes to California as a way of honoring his grandfather, builds a life and a family there, and ends up with a similar trajectory. Now, Alan Say is still alive, but that similar kind of feeling of being everywhere and nowhere at once, of wanting to see the world, but also wanting to come home. And I don't think I understood the specificity of the Japanese American immigrant experience, or the Japanese experience or Japanese American experience when I was a kid. But again, as someone who bounced around a lot with my family, I got very attached to the idea of a person who could find things to love in the various places they lived, but still never quite fully settled at home. So, the grandfather. And finally, we have, which is objectively the heaviest book, but one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. This was a completely new story to me. This is Hiroshima Nopika by Toshi Maruki. Now, I did not know this about her and her husband when I picked up this book, but it makes sense reading this text that she and her husband have been advocating for peace and nuclear disarmament for decades. As you can imagine, this book tells the story of one family in Hiroshima. Now, you go through this entire book, you see these haunting images, you read this story of fear, read the story of triumph, of family, of the strength of women, and it isn't until the very, very end that you find out in this section about this book that this was actually based on a true story. A real woman, a real Japanese woman, carried her injured husband on her back and her child in her arm for miles to escape the fires and the rubble of Hiroshima. This woman survived for days without food, days without water with her and her child, and did everything she could to try to hold them together during this incredibly horrifying time. So, if you're unfamiliar with this story, on August 6th, 1940, and now I'm forgetting the date, excuse me, August 6, 1945, the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, which was a completely civilian city. They went on to drop another nuclear bomb on Nagasaki afterwards, but Hiroshima came first. And Hiroshima was the first example we had, the first instance we had, I'm saying we because I am an American and I am part of this lineage, whether I like it or not, of using a nuclear bomb on people in such a way. And so, as you can imagine, the flash, the fire, the radiation, the destruction, absolutely horrifying. And this author and the way she talks about it really emphasizes the absolute banality of the day as it started. Just a regular family having breakfast, eating food, talking. The bomb was dropped around somewhere around 8:30 in the morning. And I feel like it is so hard sometimes to look at these massive historical events that changed hundreds of thousands of lives, that changed the course of history, and remember that in each second, each millisecond of the event itself, we're just regular everyday people. Sometimes I think it can be hard to look at history in that way. But one of the things that struck me so much about this, not just the story itself, were the ways in which she utilized color and image. So for example, all of these people here are dead. These are the piles of bodies that were killed in the initial blast. Here is one of the main characters, one of her, the little girl who's been clutching chopsticks that she was eating breakfast with for days after the event. And then you can see here, again, a little bit of color. The little girl, her mother, and the father that she had been carrying on her back, wrapped up in her clothing after he was burned desperately by the fire. Like there's, I don't know how to describe how haunting these images are to me. Like this one particularly of the little girl crying on the beach before an old woman offers her a rice ball she has in her pack for something to eat. She hasn't eaten in days, and then dying at her feet. Like it's just so specific. It is so heartbreaking, and being reminded again of the scale of destruction and the individual people just trying to find a way to survive and make lives for it afterwards. Like this is a very difficult book to read, and per everything I said earlier about still being able to talk about difficult things with your kids, I still stand by that. But I think also as a parent, you have to be really prepared, or someone who works with children prepared, to answer some of these questions like, Why would we, the United States, do that to other people? What happened to all the other little girls in the story? What happened to this main girl's father? You know, when you have, again, an image of people dying, of people just trying to rest after running for days, and then in the distance you see a torii gate, you see a sign of the divide between the spiritual world and the world of humans. When I looked at this image, all I wanted was to be on the other side of that gate. All I wanted was to like leave the idea of this cruel human world behind and enter into a spiritual world where hopefully things would be better. So again, I feel like Maruki did with this book, some of the greatest work a person can do with their art, which is to make it have a purpose. I personally do not believe in art for art's sake. Now, do I think every single piece of book, fictional media, TV show, etc. needs to be talking about racism or nuclear disarmament or homophobia or xenophobia? No, that's not what I'm saying. But even in stories such as this, as Grandfather's Journey, which tell one specific story of one specific family and a kinship that a grandson feels with his grandfather over this feeling of never quite being at home, that's what this is for too. Like I love all of these books with the exception of Peachboy, even though I think I could like a different adaptation. But this again reminded me that a person who is focused on nuclear disarmament, a person who was focused on this activism, saw value in creating an illustrated children's book about this thing, because these books matter. Like, how many times do I have to yell it? These books matter. And even when we're talking about stories like The Snow Wife, which are fantasy, which are folklore, that involve mystical things, what a beautiful story about a husband realizing that he has broken a promise to his wife, has betrayed her, and then going to the ends of the earth, facing mountain men and mountain women and yokai and kami to get her back. There's a line in this where the husband is trying to convince the wind kami, the wind god, that if he restores his wife to him, he will create a shrine or an altar and, pray to it and protect it for all these generations. And the wind god asks the valid question. He says, well, why should I trust you to keep that promise when you didn't keep the other promise? And the woodcutter says, because now I know the pain of breaking a promise and what strong honor there is in keeping one. A man admitting he's wrong, a husband breaking a promise and then doing everything he can to rectify it and learning from his mistakes. Value. I'm not implying that there's art that does not have value, but as someone who has spent enough time studying Dadaism and certain like post-modernist, satirical, ironic street art, like I get it, I get why it was so radical for Duchamp to sign that urinal and call it art. But me personally, that's not the kind of art I'm interested in. This is. So these were a few Japanese illustrated children's books that I've been really loving in the past month. If you have any like particular resources, books or documentaries about Shinto that you feel are particularly true or interesting, please send them my way. And as always, I will see you next time. Bye.